Hi there guys, welcome to this tutorial on Blake's London. So this is the AQA Power and Conflict collection, and I'm looking to compare London today in terms of the power of place, and the poem I've selected for my comparison is going to be Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Okay, what I wanted to focus on is a brief overview of some of these key elements that you would be talking about in London, and then show you a sample of some comparison I've written around London and exposure, and hopefully I'll show you how and why that would achieve a level 9. But first let's start off by sort of unpicking some of the key elements. So the keywords in our title are the power of place. Could say environment, setting, location, but it ultimately is looking at the geography of somewhere. What is it about a location or a place, and how and why is it powerful? And so straight away, to remind myself, I'm going to think about, what do I know about London? Well, I know it was from Blake's collection Songs of Experience, and he had two collections, one of Experience and then Songs of Innocence. The Songs of Experience were all quite bleak, harsh poems that sort of focused on some of the realities of life. He's writing kind of end of the 1700s, early 1800s, and he's kind of, I'd say the Songs of Experience are basically some protest poems, if you like. And he's focusing on the capital, London, and that for us as modern readers has particular connotations, doesn't it? It's our capital. It's a place to be proud of. It's a place of power and opportunity and wealth and opulence. But with that still comes great levels of deprivation, of homelessness, and that was the case far more so for Blake than it is even now. So let's think about how this narrator is walking through the streets, and think about that choice, that verb, wandered. Could have chosen anything there, walked, journeyed through each street, but it says wandered, and that to me creates this sort of casual tone, almost like he's a tourist, really taking things in. If you wander, your movement is slowly. And he refers here to the chartered street and the chartered Thames, and that word chartered is repeated here. Um, in terms of the context, it's important to know that at this time you had areas, streets and parts of the Thames which were really heavily kind of controlled and were owned in a sense by a wealthy, a relatively wealthy few who benefited from trade and whatnot. And ultimately what this did was effectively oppress the poor people. So as he's wandering near these wealthy places that are frequented by the most wealthy in society, the narrator here is drawn to something else, and he's drawn to the poverty and desperation that he sees. So when it says a mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe, we get that repetition of mark, and here it's a sign of something. So look at these words he chooses: weakness, woe, in every face I meet. And then we get the anaphora: in every cry, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every... and I'm just going to sum this up as a sea of suffering. Everywhere he looks, in every person, there are signs of desperation, hopelessness, poverty. And we get this interesting metaphor here of the mind-forged manacles, I hear. So manacles, these sort of chains that he can almost hear clinking, which really sort of makes us think of slavery. But here these are mind-forged. They're not physical chains, but it speaks very much of mental slavery and oppression. So within this place, London, it's hugely powerful because it has the power to oppress huge numbers of people and to make them feel trapped into cycles of poverty. Now he gives a few examples, and I think it's quite interesting here that we have this acrostic, like an acrostic poem. And if you take here, we've got H-E-A-R, and this acrostic then spells out here, and that really sort of conveys the sense that he's overwhelmed by the sounds as well as the sights that he's been sort of confronted by. And so what are some of the things that he hears as well as sees? Well, he talks about the chimney sweeper's cry. A really interesting image here, and it reminds us in terms of context of child exploitation. Very young boys in particular sent up chimneys, and this is like deadly and dangerous work at this point. And obviously they would be filthy. And yet it says the cry of these children, every blackening church appalls. So yeah, at the time we might have had enough filth and pollution and squalor that the church buildings would have been blackened, but really this is being used metaphorically to condemn in a way the hypocrisy of the church. The church was meant to support and help the needy, and Blake's criticism here is that they weren't doing enough. So in terms of the chimney sweepers were blackened with soot, but the church has been blackened by its inactivity and its inability to help people. And that's not the only thing Blake's critical of here. We've got the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So there's this real anger, sort of festering anger. There's all this abuse of power. You've got powerful institutions like the church and royalty, and we've got soldiers dying. Again, another metaphor here of the blood running down the palace walls. These people dying for maybe futile or pointless wars in some cases. But most. Now, this is important structurally because of all the things that Blake or the narrator has seen. We realise we're approaching a climax because he's going to tell us about what the worst thing is. Despite all of this suffering, there's something that's more horrible than even than that. So through the midnight streets I hear, and midnight immediately has those connotations of something dark, fearful, mysterious, harks back in time to ideas of the witching hour, and therefore has connotations of death. And what this narrator hears then is how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. So he's focusing here on prostitution, and we get this idea of them being youthful. Again, just like the boys are sent up chimneys, many of the young working class girls had no option but to go into prostitution. And we see here something of her, you know, she's conveyed here as being angry and furious, and actually her, whether it's swearing at the baby or just at life in general, it blasts the newborn infant's tear. So it even overwhelms the crying of a newborn baby, her newborn child, in this kind of poignant and horrific and bleak image. We know at the time that prostitution was rife, and that a couple of outcomes from this. Some of it is the rise of STIs, decay and disease, but also this idea of unwanted, unloved, illegitimate children who were born, and they themselves would soon go into that cycle of poverty and deprivation. And not only does the scream of, or the shout of this prostitute drown out the crying of her baby, it does something else as well, and it highlights some of the hypocrisy of marriage at the time, where infidelity is rife, unwanted children are abandoned, and we get that imagery of decay and disease, as well as this kind of oxymoron here of the marriage hearse, a hearse being a funeral car, and the idea of kind of a young couple or a married couple going off in a funeral car is quite a tainted image, and really it's Blake's real criticism of marriage as being something kind of tainted and blackened by the prostitution and the fact that people so readily sort of went to that that point. So it is a bleak and a dark poem. When I think about the power of place here, it's not power in a positive way. It's the sort of terrifying, in some ways, power of London and that abuse of power that we see there. And I would be really focusing on comparing this, as I mentioned, to Exposure. So I would just do my usual really tidy and neat, as you can see, London, Exposure, and I'd think again about the subject, what it's about. Oops, hope if I could spell that. The style, by which I mean the language features and the tone and the structure, how it's been put together. I'd spent a bit of time, this was me in my exam, just making some notes, putting some ideas down. So one of the things we've said about this place is that there is, well, you know, I'm going to say that it's dangerous and that it's unhealthy. And just ask yourself, can I say the same about exposure or whatever your chosen poem is? Well, yeah, it's really unhealthy. In fact, it's deadly. How is it deadly? Well, soldiers are freezing to death, aren't they? Okay. And again, I look at some of the techniques, some of the language. Well, I'm going to talk about, if I looked at the language here, I might look at words, I might think about the metaphor of the blackening church, and then I'd see, are there other examples that I can connect there within, you know, within exposure. So the planning, we could spend all of us on that, but I think that's something for you to think about and look at perhaps yourself. So in terms of now a level 9 style response, here's one I have had a go at earlier. As with other poems that I've looked at, I always would begin with both and draw together something that both poets do. So I'm focusing here on the fact that both Blake and Owen convey the destructive power of place, and that's immediately evaluative. Just by putting an adjective in front of that, I'm showing that I understand that the places in both poems are actually damaging and destructive. So in London we see the damage caused by inequality and poverty, and in Exposure we see soldiers from World War I dying of exposure to terrible weather as they waited, traumatised, to be sent to the front line to fight. Blake, writing for his Songs of Experience, focused on the bleak reality of life in the late 1700s and early 1800s. In London, his first-person narrator wandered, evoking a sense of someone absorbing sights and sounds. So, embedded small quotes. I've got here, you know, some context here about Blake and what he's doing. Indeed, in lines 9 to 12, he uses the acrostic here in order to show readers that London confronted and challenged his senses. The chartered streets and River Thames are juxtaposed, so I've got some structure in there, with the repetition of marks of weakness and woe, indicating the virtual sea of suffering he witnessed. The anaphoric in every indicates that this is the dominant site, powerless people being oppressed by powerful people. So again, I'm finding lots of bits of techniques, but they're all building up my main point and my main argument. Okay, Blake draws on the image of industrial London by drawing attention to the chimney sweeper's cry, which reminds readers about the appalling treatment of children who were exploited as workers, forced into dangerous jobs, and who experienced no support from the blackening church. Here, Blake uses the metaphor blackening, so I've got some language, and I'm really doing that thing I've mentioned loads of times, which is about zooming in on a particular word and doing plenty with it, to show the church's hypocrisy and guilt. In London, at this time, there was pollution and filth, but it is their neglect of the needy which really taints the church. Likewise, so you'll see a pattern from the videos I'm doing, which is to really go into depth with the poem that's in front of you and show off some good AO2 skill, and then bring in your other poem, incorporate and sustain that comparison, obviously, to get the high marks. So likewise, in Exposure, comma missing, Hughes shows that in this place, a freezing battlefield, the men are neglected and left to die. The rhetorical question, what are we doing here, conveys the narrator's doubt, fear and helplessness, just like in London. So again, more sustained comparison. Just like in London, where hapless soldiers died for their country, metaphorically staining palace walls, metaphorically, with blood. In Exposure, the soldiers turn back to our dying. They've been sent into an equally futile war, and as with London, again more comparison, they are abandoned by those who should protect them. Both poems have a distinct undertone of anger and resentment towards those who have power in certain places. Both poems seem to suggest that these environments are deadly, needlessly so. And really, it's this bit I kind of I'd sort of almost finished off over the other side, and but the geeky English teacher in me had to carry on. And really, it's this where we've got this sustained comparison that's going to push you up to those very, very top levels. You know, where you can make point after point about what both poems are trying to achieve, or the message that both poems are trying to convey to their readers. And equally, that could be things that are dissimilar. It doesn't have to be that they're both doing the same thing, but it's the idea of sustaining the comparison and keeping it going. But I think as a structure, this is the best approach. Start off by exploring something that both poems do, then really do show off some great AO2 skill. Find language, find structure, think about what the poets are doing, get yourself some context in there, and then try and sustain some nice comparison to your poem that you've not got in front of you. You're going to have to be a bit more sort of speaking more general terms about the message of that second poem, even if you've got a few quotes in front of you. Okay, I hope that was useful. Thanks for watching, guys.